Imagine dying. Imagine crossing over, leaving everything behind. The pain, the fear, the weight of being alive, and arriving somewhere you thought was safe. Somewhere called Soul Society, the afterlife. The place where souls go when they're done with the world of the living. You made it through. You survived. But what if the thing that hunts you, the thing that feeds on your fear, doesn't care whether you're alive or dead? What if it followed you here? What if it was already waiting? Music intensifies, then sudden silence. Welcome to Horror Multiverse. Today's question: what if Pennywise, the ancient dimension-hopping entity from Stephen King's YT, invaded Soul Society during the height of the 1,000-year blood war? Not to fight, not to conquer, to eat. And before this story ends, the oldest Captain Commander in history will be brought to his knees. The most fearless warrior in Soul Society will discover something he never knew was inside him. And a cosmic horror that has consumed 47 realities will find something it has been searching for longer than Soul Society has existed. This is not a battle story. This is a consumption story. Let's begin. Segment 1. The silence spreads. The Seraite had survived everything. Izen's betrayal, the Espada, a man who called himself God and nearly proved it. The white walls of Soul Society had cracked and burned and been rebuilt so many times that the stonecutters who maintained them had stopped keeping records. There was comfort in that history. The comfort of a place that endures when everything else breaks. That comfort was about to become the most expensive mistake in Soul Society's long and bloody history. It started in the 78th district of Rukongai. Not with an explosion. Not with a spiritual pressure signature the sensors could track. Not with any warning sign that the Gotei 13's intelligence network had been trained to detect. It started with children going quiet. The 78th district was always loud, the desperate, necessary noise of a place where too many souls crowded into too little space. Street vendors, gambling dens, the constant negotiation of people who had arrived in the afterlife with nothing and were rebuilding from zero. Always loud. 3 days into the 1,000-year blood war. 3 days in, when every captain was stretched thin and every resource was pointed at the Vandenreich. The 78th district went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. The prey quiet. The hiding quiet. The silence of a forest when a predator is moving through it that none of the animals have seen yet. But all of them have already smelled. Lieutenant Izan Kotetsu arrived for a routine welfare check and found the streets empty at midday. Shops open, food still cooking on stalls. A dice game abandoned mid-roll, the dice still showing their last numbers, the money still in the pot. Everyone simply gone. No blood, no hollow signature, no Quincy energy readings. The sensing array showed every soul still present. They just weren't anywhere she could find them. She went deeper into the district, found one person, an old man sitting against a wall in a narrow alley, knees drawn up, rocking slowly. She called to him. He looked up. His eyes were the color of old rust. "He's tasting us," the old man said. His voice was perfectly calm, the calm of someone who had already processed their terror and come out the other side of it. He started with the children. Fear in children hasn't been complicated yet by guilt or regret. It tastes cleaner. The old man tilted his head. "He says you taste interesting. The death workers. He's never eaten anything that works with death before. He wants to know if it makes the fear different." A pause. "It does. He says it does. He's very pleased. Izane's hand went to her zanpakudo. The old man smiled. The smile went too wide. Not supernaturally wide, just slightly, precisely too wide. In the way that made some deep animal part of Izane's brain file an urgent report, the thing using this old man's face had not perfectly calibrated how wide a human smile should go. "He says hello," the old man said. The alley went dark. Not dark like shadow. Dark like the concept of darkness arriving to remind light that it had always been a guest. Izane flash-stepped out with shaking hands and reported to Captain Unohana. The 78th District was compromised. Unknown entity. Unknown classification. Ability to affect civilian souls without leaving detectable spiritual residue. Unohana's response came back in 4 seconds. Return to the Serai-T immediately. Touch nothing. Speak to no one in the district. A pause. And Izane, do not look back while you're leaving. Izane didn't ask why. She didn't look back. Behind her, from the darkness of the alley, the sound of a balloon string being pulled taut, then released. Then a voice. Not the old man's voice anymore. Something underneath it. Something that had been using the old man's voice as a ventriloquist uses a puppet. A child's voice. Delighted. Hungry. "Soul Society," it said, tasting the words like someone tasting a new fruit for the first time. Oh, this is wonderful. This is the place where fear goes when people die and think they're done with it. Laughter. Genuine. Bright. Awful. They're never done with it. Captain Commander Yamamoto called the emergency session at dawn. The War Council chamber had seen crisis meetings before. The night Aizen's betrayal was confirmed, the morning Yuachi's invasion began. Those meetings had begun with known quantities. Enemies with names, power signatures, histories that could be cataloged and analyzed and built tactical responses against. Those meetings had begun with fear, but it was a structured fear, a fear with edges. This meeting began with Captain Unohana placing Izane's report on the central table, and every captain in the room reading it, and then looking at each other with the particular expression of experienced combatants encountering their first genuinely unknown variable. 60,000 souls, Unohana said, the 78th District's registered population, all still registering on the sensing arrays as present, none locatable by any conventional means. Hollow, Byakuya, immediate, practical. No hollow signature, the souls haven't been eaten. The arrays would show that. They're present. They're simply elsewhere. Quincy, Hitsugaya, ice blue eyes sharp, already calculating. No Quincy energy signature. This leaves nothing. Complete operational silence. Kenpachi Zaraki spoke from the corner. He'd been standing with his arms crossed since the meeting started. One entity. The report mentions one entity. How does one entity move 60,000 souls without leaving a trace? Nobody answered immediately. Mayuri Kurotsuchi had been studying Asan's report with the unsettling intensity of a scientist who has found a specimen worth dissecting. The operational profile is unlike anything in my database, he said, which is, as everyone in this room knows, a database without significant gaps. He said it without vanity, just fact. The absence of detectable spiritual residue suggests either a technique so advanced it leaves no trace, or an entity that does not operate within the spiritual energy framework our sensing systems are designed to detect. A pause. Or both. Shunsui Kyoraku said it quietly, from where he was leaning against the wall with his hat tilted down. Meaning it might be invisible to everything we have. Sensing arrays, spiritual pressure detection, Quincy counter-surveillance. If it doesn't operate in the reishi framework, none of it touches it. That's a pleasant thought, Rangiku said. The sarcasm was thin over something that was not sarcasm at all. What does it want? Kenpachi asked. The question sat in the room. Because the answer was in the report. Everyone had read it, and no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it the kind of real that required a response. And none of them had a response prepared. Unohana said it, because Unohana had spent more centuries than most of them with death in all its forms. And she had learned that naming things was the first step to addressing them. It wants to eat our fear, she said. Specifically, it wants to eat the fear that exists in beings who work with death. It believes our fear is different, more complex, more seasoned. Her eyes were steady. It has never encountered soul reapers before. We are a novelty to it. The chamber was very quiet. Then Yamamoto stood. The temperature in the room didn't change, but something in the atmosphere shifted. The way atmosphere shifts around something that has made a decision of sufficient weight. We are not a novelty, he said. We are the Gotei 13, and whatever this thing is, whatever it eats, wherever it came from, however it moves, it is in our house. His eyes swept the room. Find it, contain it, and remind it what soul reapers do to things that prey on souls in our care. In the 79th district, one beyond where the silence had started, a balloon seller found his entire stock floating at the wrong angle, all the strings pointing not upward, but inward, towards some central point that wasn't visible. He stared at them for a long moment. Then his eyes went the color of old rust, and he sat down against his cart and began to wait. The silence was spreading. Mayuri's research division worked for 6 hours straight, produced exactly nothing useful. This was unprecedented. This division had produced actionable intelligence on Hollows, Arankar, Vizard, Fullbringers, Quincy, mod souls, artificial souls, corrupted souls, and on 3 occasions, things that technically didn't exist. 6 hours of analysis, 17 different detection methodologies. The output was a blank, not inconclusive, not preliminary, blank, as if something had reached into the space where the data should be and removed not the data, but the possibility of the data existing. Mayuri presented his non-findings to Yamamoto with the expression of a scientist who has encountered the first thing in his career he cannot immediately classify, and process the experience by deciding he hated it deeply. The entity leaves no spiritual trace because it does not interact with spiritual energy, he said. It interacts with something else, something that spiritual energy exists within the way a fish exists within water. The fish isn't the water, but the water determines everything about where the fish can go and what it can do. He paused. This entity operates in the water, not the fish. Meaning, Yamamoto said. Meaning our Zanpakudo, our Kido, our Bankai. All of it is fish. This entity is water. We cannot cut it with something that exists inside it. The silence that followed had a specific quality. It was the silence of the Gotei 13's War Council discovering that the word impossible had been quietly added to the vocabulary of a situation that had been using difficult until 30 seconds ago. By dawn, 6 outer districts of Rukongai had gone quiet. The sensing arrays showed 400,000 souls still registering as present, still unlocatable, still elsewhere. And in the Seirei itself, in the barracks of the 11th Division, 3 of Kenpachi's officers didn't show up for morning training. Their rooms were empty. Their zanpakudo were on their racks. Their spiritual signatures registered on the arrays as present. Kenpachi stood in each empty room for a long moment, reading the space the way he read everything, not with analysis, but with the combat instinct of a man who had spent his entire life learning what the air felt like before violence. The air felt wrong. Not wrong like before a fight. Wrong like after one. Like something had already happened here, and he had missed it. Something had moved through the most dangerous building in the Serai without triggering a single alarm, without leaving a single trace, without waking a single person, had walked through like the building was empty, and taken 3 of his people. Kenpachi put his hand on the grip of his zanpakudo, not drawing it, just touching it. The habitual contact of a man checking that the thing he trusted most was still there, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not from cold, not from spiritual pressure, from the specific animal signal his body sent when it detected something his conscious mind hadn't fully processed yet. Something that shouldn't be possible was possible. Something was in soul society that his sword couldn't touch, from the darkest corner of the empty room, where the dawn light from the narrow window didn't reach. A sound, barely a sound. The creak of something being held taut, then released. Then a voice that was almost not a voice. "The angry one," it said. "I've been saving the angry ones. Anger is fear's favorite coat. I like getting to the thing underneath." Kenpachi drew his sword. The corner was empty. The sound was gone. But the darkness in the corner was the wrong shade. Captain Rojuro Otoribashi, Rose, was not supposed to be the first captain to make contact. The plan had been systematic. Investigation teams, never less than 3 seated officers, captains on standby, standard containment protocol. Careful, methodical. Rose had gone alone because he heard music. Not metaphorically, actual music. A melody, 3 notes, repeating, coming from the direction of the 79th District's outer wall. He told his team to hold position and walk toward it alone because the music was the most beautiful thing he had heard in decades. And he was, at his core, before the zanpakudo and the captain's haori and the centuries of combat, a musician, a man for whom beauty was its own sufficient reason. The melody was coming from a child, sitting on top of the outer wall, legs dangling over the drop, perfectly balanced in a way that immediately registered as wrong, playing something on an instrument Rose couldn't identify, not from any musical tradition he knew, and he knew most of them, an instrument that caught the pre-dawn light and returned it in slightly wrong colors. "What are you playing?" Rose asked. The child looked down. "Something I composed," it said. "I compose something for each new place I visit, something that fits the specific flavor of its fear." It tilted its head. "Would you like to hear Soul Society's movement?" Rose's hand went to his zanpakudo. "Play it," he said. The child played 3 notes, the same 3 notes from the melody. But now they resolved into context, and the context was devastating. Because the 3 notes sounded exactly like grief, not like a musical representation of grief, not a composer approximating an emotion, like grief itself, distilled into sound, the specific resonance of loss at its most concentrated. Rose's reiatsu flickered. He felt it happen. The involuntary response in his own spiritual pressure, the way his reiatsu flinched, the way eyes flinch from bright light. He was a captain, He had precise control of his spiritual energy, built over centuries of training. The flicker lasted 0.3 seconds. In 0.3 seconds, the child had moved from the top of the wall to directly in front of him. No flash step, no visible movement. Simply, there instead of there. Up close, the child's face was fine, normal, a child's face, except the eyes, which were the color of something that didn't have a color in any language Rose knew. Something between orange and the concept of hunger. "Your fear is beautiful," the child said. "You're afraid of irrelevance, of creating something perfect and having no one capable of appreciating it." It smiled. "Most warriors are afraid of losing. You're afraid of winning without being understood." Rose released his shikai. The whip form of Kinshara extended golden in the dawn light, the blade at its tip catching the first direct sunlight of morning. He moved. The child didn't dodge. The blade passed through it, not through a projection, through its physical form, through the space its body occupied, and found nothing, no resistance, no spiritual body. The blade passed through as if the child were made of the space between things rather than the things themselves. The child looked down at where the blade had passed through it with mild interest. "Oh," it said, "that should have hurt." It looked back up at Rose. "That should have hurt." And this time the voice had something underneath it, something vast and very old and absolutely delighted. "Your weapon works within the spiritual framework of this world. I don't." The smile widened. "I'm not a spiritual entity. I'm not a physical entity. I'm what exists in the space that your spiritual framework is built on top of. Your sword cannot cut me for the same reason a fish cannot cut the ocean." Rose flash stepped back 20 meters. His Reiatsu was still flickering. He could feel something reaching into the frequency of his spiritual pressure, pulling at individual threads of it, unraveling slowly the way cloth unravels when one thread is found and pulled consistently. "What are you doing to my Reiatsu?" he demanded. "Tasting it," the child said, from directly behind him now. It pressed one finger against the back of Rose's neck. "I can feel all of it. The music you've never written because you were afraid it wouldn't be good enough. The compositions you burned. The sound you heard the moment you first achieved Bankai. And never managed to reproduce in any piece you've created since." The finger pressed slightly harder. "That sound is your core fear. The proof of what you could be, used as constant evidence of what you're not." Rose's knees hit the ground, not from pain, from the weight of it, something reaching into the machinery of his Reiatsu and turning it against itself, using the frequency of his personal dread to interfere with the frequency of his power. His Zanpakuto reverted to sealed form. He hadn't chosen that. It happened the way breathing changes when something has its hands around your throat. "Excellent," the child said, crouching in front of him with those wrong eyes level with his. The Gotei 13 Zanpakuto are powered by their wielder's spiritual pressure. Their spiritual pressure runs on the frequency of their individual soul. And individual souls, every single one, run underneath everything else on the frequency of their deepest fear. It smiled, and for just a moment, behind the child's face, something else showed, vast and dark and incomprehensibly hungry. "I don't fight your strength. I find the string that your strength hangs on." A pause. "And I pull it." Rose's team found him 3 minutes later, unconscious against the outer wall, his Zanpakuto sealed, his Reiatsu thinner, as if something had peeled back a single layer of it and kept it. When he woke in the infirmary and reached for the melody in his head, the deep internal space where his music gestated before it became sound, it was still there. But the three notes were different now. They were Pennywise's three notes, playing on repeat, in the space where Rose's own music lived, like a parasite settling into a host, not destroying the host, not replacing it, just occupying it. He didn't tell the healers. He didn't tell his team. He sat up and looked at the wall where the child had stood and said nothing, because the thing living in his music now was listening, and it already knew everything he was afraid of. Above the outer wall, drifting in the direction of the Seraiti, toward the white towers, toward the captain's barracks, a red balloon, floating downward, against gravity, finding its way in. Yamamoto had not slept in 4 days. This was not unusual for wartime. He had gone longer. What was unusual was that he was dreaming while awake, not hallucinating, something more precise than that, more surgical, in the spaces between conscious thoughts, between one tactical assessment and the next. Images arrived, clear, specific, uninvited. His lieutenants from the original Gotei 13, not the current roster, the ones who had died. Every face was someone he had failed to save. He recognized psychological manipulation immediately. He had lived long enough to know every category of it. He noted the images, identified their source as external rather than internal, and filed a tactical update. The entity had extended its operational range to include the Seraiti proper, had selected the captain commander as a priority target. He told no one, not because he was proud. Pride was for younger men. He told no one because the captain commander's function during wartime was to be the fixed point around which everything else oriented. The moment he revealed vulnerability, the attention of his entire command structure would divide. He could not afford that. He felt the moment it found what it was looking for. It felt like a hand closing around something he kept in the place behind thought, the place where things too heavy to carry consciously got stored and maintained and never quite let go of. The hand didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just held, so he could feel the shape of what it was holding. Shinjiro, a lieutenant from 300 years ago, young, exceptionally talented, dead because Yamamoto had sent him into an engagement with a threat he had assessed as below the threshold requiring captain intervention. The assessment had been wrong, by exactly enough to be fatal. The mathematics of that error had been processed and filed and labeled as a tactical lesson. The thing holding it now showed it to him not as a tactical lesson, as what it was, as a 23-year-old Shinigami who had trusted his captain commander's judgment completely and been killed by it. Yamamoto's Reiatsu spiked. The walls of his command chamber cracked. He stood in the northwest corner, where the ambient light from the high windows didn't fully reach. The darkness was the wrong shade. "You've been in here for some time," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. The voice of a man who had delivered death sentences and eulogies and battle orders for 1,000 years. "Oh, much longer than you think," something said from the corner. Pleasant, conversational, coming from multiple points simultaneously. "I arrived here before I arrived at your outer districts. The outer districts were feeding. This," a pause, "this was reconnaissance. You targeted me first. I target the anchor first. Every structure has an anchor, the load-bearing point, whose removal causes the most comprehensive collapse. In this structure, that's you. Another pause. Though targeted implies confrontation. I don't confront. I cultivate. What stood in the northwest corner was not a child. Something that wore the suggestion of a silhouette rather than a complete physical form. A darkness that had decided to be approximately person-shaped as a courtesy. 2 points of light in the darkness. Orange, deep, old. 1,017 years, Pennywise said. That's how long you've been operating at this capacity. 1,017 years of decisions that determined who lived and who died, and who became a tactical lesson, and who became a name on a monument. The orange light shifted. Do you know what that much guilt tastes like? I don't experience guilt, Yamamoto said. He released his zanpakudo from its sealed state. The temperature in the room rose 40 degrees in 2 seconds. I make assessments, account for losses, and continue. That is, command. That is what you tell yourself command is, Pennywise said. The vocabulary is very clean, very functional. Losses. Assessments. The language of a man who has spent 1,000 years building a system for experiencing devastation without being devastated. The orange lights brightened. But every system for managing guilt has one thing in common. It doesn't eliminate the guilt. It compresses it, stores it, keeps it in a chamber below the functional chambers, accessible only in specific conditions. The darkness shifted, spread. The ambient light in the room began to go wrong. I am the specific condition. Bankai, Yamamoto said. The word landed like a stone in water. Zanka no tachi. The fire didn't expand. That was the first misunderstanding people always had about Yamamoto's Bankai. They expected the enormous external inferno. Instead, the fire collapsed inward, condensed, poured itself into the blade. The room went from 40 degrees above normal to 400 degrees above normal in a single breath. The darkness recoiled. Not much, not dramatically, but it recoiled. And in that recoil, Yamamoto saw what he needed to see. The entity had a physical relationship with the environment. It responded to stimuli. Something about Zanka no Tachi's heat reached it. He swung. The blade crossed the room at Captain Commander speed, a redefinition of what was possible within the spatial relationship between one point and another. It passed through the darkness, made contact, a microsecond of real resistance, and then through. The darkness was still there, but diminished, perhaps 10% of it gone, burned away in the specific sense of fire burning morning mist. The mist isn't gone. It's changed state, gone somewhere else. You can burn me, Pennywise said, from the 10% that wasn't there anymore, from the absence. Your fire is old enough and pure enough to reach the layer where I exist. A pause. But you already know the problem. Yamamoto knew the problem. Zanka no Tachi, the sword that gathered every fire in the world into a single blade, which meant every fire in the world was gone while the Bankai was active. Every fire. The Seraite's temperatures dropping to lethal cold wherever the heat was pulled. His strongest weapon made the environment around it uninhabitable. A city full of souls. His captains and their lieutenants and millions of civilian souls in Rukongai. He could not hold Bankai in a populated area for more than minutes. He knew this. Pennywise knew he knew this. 1,017 years, Pennywise said, softer now. And the strongest weapon you have is one you can't use without killing everything you're protecting. Does that seem like design to you? Or accident? Yamamoto released Bankai. The heat snapped back. The room normalized. The darkness was still there. All of it. The 10% he'd burned away had returned, recoalesced, the entity restoring itself with the casual completeness of a thing that had no concept of irreversible damage. "I've been in 47 realities," Pennywise said. "I've consumed the dominant species of every one of them. I've eaten gods, actual gods, with worshippers and cosmic authority and weapons that rewrote physical law. None of them lasted as long as you have in this conversation." The orange lights brightened. "That's a compliment. For me, that's the highest compliment possible." "You require certainty," the darkness continued, moving toward him. Slow, deliberate. "The knowledge that your decisions were right, that the deaths under your command were necessary, that Shinjiro died for a reason sufficient to justify the dying." The darkness was very close now. "I can give you that, not the lie of it, the actual thing. I can tell you definitively whether your decisions were correct." Yamamoto's grip on his Zanpakuto tightened. "The answer is no," the darkness said, before he could speak. "Not all of them. Most, but not all. 17 decisions in 1,000 years, where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. 17 souls who would have lived." The orange lights were level with his eyes. "You knew this. You've always known this. The guilt isn't irrational, Genryusai. It's accurate." The first time in the conversation that it had used his given name. The Reiatsu destabilization was subtle. He almost missed it. The edges of his spiritual pressure fraying at a frequency so specific to the resonance of his deepest guilt that it bypassed every defensive system he had built over a millennium of self-discipline. "You are magnificent," Pennywise said, directly in front of him now, the darkness complete around them both. "The finest thing I've tasted in 47 realities. I want you to know that. Before I take the part of you that knows how to be magnificent, I want you to understand what you're losing." Yamamoto activated Shikai. Ryujin Jakka became fire. Walls of it, the alarms in the command chamber screaming as the heat sensors registered impossible temperatures. The fire met the darkness. For 60 seconds, it was genuinely unclear which would win. Fire and darkness, the most fundamental opposition in the physical world, expressed at the level of a captain commander's full spiritual pressure and a cosmic entity's full operational capacity. At 61 seconds, the fire began to go wrong. The color changed, at the edges first, shifting from white gold to something redder, then darker, then something that wasn't quite the color of fire anymore. It was the color of old rust, the color of a balloon. "There," Pennywise said, through the corrupted fire, through Yamamoto's own Zanpakuto's flames turned fractionally wrong. "There it is, the seam, the specific thread." Yamamoto felt his Zanpakuto shudder. Not the physical blade, the connection, the bond between Shinigami and Zanpakuto built over centuries of communion. That bond shuddered, like a voice going wrong mid-sentence. "Ryujin Jakka," he said. Just the name, checking. The response came back wrong. Not absent, not silent. Wrong. The frequency of Ryujin Jakka's spiritual presence. The fire nature, the ancient personality of a Zanpakuto that had existed as long as he had, was still there, but overlaid with something. A competing signal. Ryujin Jakka was still there, but it was afraid. His Zanpakuto was afraid. In 47 realities, across uncountable consumed civilizations, Yamamoto Genryusai Shigakuni was the first being whose own weapon had registered fear at the approach of consumption. Pennywise paused. A genuine pause. The pause of something encountering data that requires processing before the next action. a Zanpakuto's fear, a weapon that was also a soul, feeling the approach of the same thing its wielder felt, responding with the same signal at the same frequency. Doubled fear, one from the Shinigami, one from the blade. "Oh," Pennywise said. The orange lights brightened to something approaching white. "Oh, this is new." When Shunsui Kyoraku burned through the heat-sealed entrance of the command chamber, the room was cold. Not normal cold. The cold of a place where fire had been and was no longer. Yamamoto was on one knee in the center of the room, his Zanpakuto in his hand, sealed form, the blade wrong, the metal dark where it should have been bright, a darkness moving slowly through the steel like ink through water. His Reiatsu was present, registering on every array as present, but thinner, layered wrong. His eyes were fine, normal color, looking at Shunsui with complete recognition. But when he spoke, the voice was his, mostly. "Assemble the captains," Yamamoto said. "We need to discuss a change of strategy." Shunsui had known Yamamoto for 200 years. He heard the voice and knew it was right. He looked at the Zanpakuto and knew something was wrong. He said nothing. He assembled the captains. Shunsui Kyoraku had a gift. Not his Zanpakuto, though Kaiten Kyokatsu was extraordinary. Not his Shiki, not his Bankai, not the particular genius of a fighting style that had taken centuries to develop and could not be replicated because it required a specific kind of mind. His gift was simpler than any of that. He could read rooms, not spiritually, through the accumulated observation of a being who had spent 2 centuries paying close attention to the specific micro-language of how people occupied space together. The angle of a shoulder, the quality of silence between people who were usually loud, the particular way someone looked at something they were pretending not to look at. He read the War Council chamber the moment he walked in, and what he read made him quietly, immediately, and completely terrified in a way he did not show on his face, because showing it would have been the most dangerous thing he could do. Yamamoto at the head of the table. Almost correct. Almost. 1 degree off from the characteristic straightness that 1,000 years of command had made structural. A single degree of forward lean that Yamamoto's spine simply did not do, had never done, the way certain habits of posture persist through injury and exhaustion and anything else the body endures. Byakuya to the left. Correct position, correct expression. But his eyes moved with the slight excess of someone periodically checking something he was trying not to be seen checking. He was watching Yamamoto. Kenpachi in the far corner, hand on his Zanpakuto. Not casually, with the specific grip of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. He was also watching Yamamoto. Hitsugaya. Frost spreading slowly from his palm flat on the table. His spiritual pressure leaked cold only when he was suppressing a significant emotional response. Right now, he was very cold. He was also watching Yamamoto. "Consolidation," Yamamoto said. "Pull all captain-level forces back to the Seraite proper. Abandon the outer districts. They are already lost. We accept the loss and protect what we can protect." The silence was the kind that forms when everyone in a room has a response, and no one wants to be the first to give it. "That's 800,000 souls," Shunsui said pleasantly. "Tactical waste," Yamamoto said. "Spending captain-level resources, attempting recovery against an enemy immune to our primary weapon systems is tactical waste." Shunsui's smile stayed exactly where it was. Tactical waste. Yamamoto had never, in 2 centuries, described a soul as tactical waste in a council session. Mayuri spoke. The proposal just made would gather every captain in the Seiraite's most central and confined location simultaneously, while ceding all outer territory and the 800,000 souls displaced within it. He paused. The most efficient delivery mechanism for the highest value targets in Soul Society, voluntarily assembled in a single location. The room went very still. Yamamoto looked around the room, at each face, the look of genuine assessment, the real Yamamoto version. And something in it changed, something that might have been, in a face less disciplined, recognition. "You all noticed," he said, not a question. "The proposal I made, consolidation, abandoning the outer districts," he paused. "That was not my proposal. It's been in the bond since the engagement in my command chamber," Yamamoto continued, "running suggestions, not replacing my cognition. It doesn't replace, it introduces small inputs, suggestions that feel like my own thoughts because they arrive in my frequency, using my language, my patterns." He looked at Ryujin Jakka, the dark ink-like shadow still moving slowly through the metal. It accessed Ryujin Jakka's spirit to calibrate the frequency, used the bond to learn how I think, and then began generating thoughts in my voice. "The consolidated proposal," Shunsui said quietly, "would have assembled all of us in one room," Yamamoto confirmed, "while the entity consumed everything outside it." He set his jaw. He looked at Mayuri. "Your countermeasure theory, how quickly can you develop it?" "With a cooperative subject of sufficient power." "You have one," Yamamoto said. "But first," he stood. Every captain straightened automatically. "Kenpachi, the 79th district, you said you wanted to fight it." Kenpachi's grin appeared, the one that meant yes before the word did. "Buy us time," Yamamoto said. "Whatever time you can." Kenpachi was gone before the sentence finished. The wall of the chamber had a Kenpachi-shaped hole in it from his exit. He'd gone through rather than around, the most direct route being through the structural obstacle rather than the door. "Kyoraku," Yamamoto said. Shunsui looked at him. "I am going to have a more direct conversation with the thing in my Zanpakuto, without the council room audience." He paused. "If it has access to my bond, it has access to my command decisions the moment I make them. The only way to operate with strategic integrity is to isolate the compromised element." Another pause. "That element is me." Shunsui looked at him for a long moment. "I'll be outside the door," Shunsui said. "I know you will." The captains filed out. Shunsui pulled the door closed behind him, stood in the corridor with his back against the wall and his hat pulled down and his Zanpakuto loose in its sheath. From inside the chamber, silence. Then Yamamoto's voice, alone, speaking to something in his own blade. The words were inaudible through the door. Down the corridor, from the direction of the outer districts, a sound, distant, enormous. The particular quality of destruction that happened when Kenpachi Zaraki found something worth hitting and stopped pretending to have limits. Shunsui stood in the corridor and waited, afraid in the quiet, competent, fully functional way that people who are good at their jobs are afraid when the job has exceeded the parameters it was designed for. Behind the closed door, a single sound, brief, sharp. The sound of a Zanpakuto's sealed blade being drawn. Then nothing. Then from somewhere in the Seiraite, not from inside the room, from the walls themselves, from the stone, 3 notes of a music box melody, playing in the dark. The 79th district had been beautiful once. The beauty of a place that had survived being itself for long enough that survival became its own kind of elegance. Old stone buildings repaired with different stone. Markets that had operated in the same locations for centuries, the ground worn smooth by the passage of feet that no longer existed. All of it was silent now. Kenpachi landed in the main market square. The impact leaving cracks radiating 3 meters in every direction from his feet, and stood in the center with his hand on his zanpakudo and his eye patch doing what it always did. The silence had a texture like held breath, like something very large in a very small space, making itself as still as possible. "Oi," Kenpachi said to the empty market. "I know you're here. The old man sent me to buy time." He rolled his neck left, right, the crack of joints loud in the silence. "I don't do buying time. I do fighting things until they stop moving, or I do." He drew his zanpakudo. "So come out and let's figure out which one of us is which." Every shadow in the market square moved simultaneously. Not toward him, away. Every shadow pulling back from the center of the square, retreating to the edges of buildings, to alley entrances, clearing the center as if making space, as if the center needed to be empty for what was about to occupy it. It was standing 20 meters away, not the child, something larger, much larger, wearing the full Pennywise form at a scale that was wrong. 7 feet tall where 5.5 was the design, proportions subtly off in every dimension simultaneously, hands too large, head too wide. The smile occupying more of the face than a smile had room to occupy. The orange eyes, deep, old. "The one who isn't afraid," Pennywise said. "I've been watching you since I arrived. You're the one that keeps not fitting my models." "Good," Kenpachi said. "I hate fitting things." "You're not afraid of me," Pennywise said. "I've been in your seirite for hours. I've touched most of the significant Reiatsu signatures. Everyone registers fear. The composition varies. Some are afraid of failure, some of loss, some of specific memories, but fear is always present. The base frequency." The orange eyes moved over Kenpachi with something that was almost scientific attention. "You have no base frequency. There's nothing underneath the aggression. No layer below the wanting to fight. Most warriors use aggression to manage fear. You use it to replace something that isn't there." "Are you going to talk more, or are we doing this?" Kenpachi asked. "Both," it said. Simultaneously. It moved. Not across the square, through it. The spatial relationship between its starting position and Kenpachi's position edited rather than traversed. Kenpachi barely got his blade up in time. The block landed. He felt the impact travel up his arms and into his shoulders and register in his spine as something significant. He grinned. The block had connected. His blade had met something real. Something with mass and resistance, something that pushed back, something he could hit. "There you are," he said. He pushed back. Full strength, no reserve. The philosophy of a man who had decided early that limits were for people who hadn't found the right opponent yet. The push sent Pennywise back 3 meters. Actually sent it back. Displaced it. Moved something that had demonstrated it could not be moved by Yamamoto's fire. Pennywise looked at the 3 meters between them. Then at Kenpachi. The orange eyes brightened. Actual brightening. The color shifting warmer, more intense. The way a fire brightens when given better fuel. "Oh," it said. "Yeah," Kenpachi said, and came in again. Kenpachi's zanpakudo was cutting Pennywise where Yamamoto's hadn't, where every spiritual technique deployed so far hadn't. Not because of a technique, not a special property of the blade. Something simpler, something more profound. Kenpachi's Zanpakuto had no fear, because Kenpachi had no fear. The bond between Shinigami and Zanpakuto was a two-way channel. Pennywise had exploited this in every other encounter, used the bond to run interference, corrupt the Reiatsu at its shared frequency. But the interference worked by finding the fear resonance and using it as a carrier signal. Kenpachi and his Zanpakuto shared the same absence. No fear in the wielder, no fear in the blade. The channel was clean, nothing to hijack. And without the interference, the bond was pure, the most direct possible connection between a Shinigami's intent and the blade's expression of that intent. Pure intent, traveling through an uncompromised bond, expressed as an edge that cut not with spiritual energy, but with the concentrated directness of a will that had never been diluted by anything as complicated as self-preservation. It reached the substrate layer. It cut. "You can't be afraid," Pennywise said, retreating 2 steps. "I can't find the thread because there is no thread." The orange eyes steadied. "So you're a body problem, not a mind problem. Physical disruption rather than psychological consumption." It looked at Kenpachi with something that was not quite respect, but was the cousin of it. "I haven't had a body problem in 14 realities." "Good," Kenpachi said. "I'd hate to be boring." Pennywise's form expanded. In a single expansion, the 7-foot form becoming something larger, the clown shape stretching outward and upward and sideways simultaneously. 15 feet, 20. The orange eyes rising as the form rose, the smile unchanged by scale. The ground cracked under the weight of expanded presence. Kenpachi looked up. His grin widened. "There we go," he said. He removed his eye patch. The Reiatsu came out. The 79th District's remaining structures, the ones that had survived the silence and the atmospheric changes, came down. Not explosively. The walls simply fell outward, pressed by the edge of Kenpachi's released Reiatsu, like objects pressed flat by a wave. Pennywise's expanded form took 1 step back, the involuntary step of something registering a pressure level it hadn't anticipated. Kenpachi was already in the air. The leap covered 30 meters in a vertical axis, bringing him level with the expanded form's face, and the Zanpakuto came down with everything. The impact was visible from the Seirite walls. A column of displaced air and released spiritual pressure rising from the 79th District like a detonation. In the ruins below, Pennywise's expanded form had a wound. A real one, dark, wrong, moving. The disrupted substrate layer darkness of something that had been cut by a blade that reached where blades weren't supposed to reach. Not fatal. Nothing about Pennywise was quickly fatal. That was a fundamental property of something that predated the concept of death. But real. Present. The first actual damage it had sustained since arriving in Soul Society. Kenpachi landed in the ruins, blood running freely from a dozen impacts across his body. He'd lost significant blood volume. His Reiatsu was compensating, as it always did. The spiritual pressure maintaining his body's function as it had always maintained it. The particular resilience of a being who had made his body's limits a matter of personal philosophical objection. He was grinning with every tooth he had. "More," he said. The wound in Pennywise's form closed. Not healed. Covered. The darkness folding back over it. The surface restoring while the damage remained on the inside. The wound was still there. It would stay there. Then from somewhere that wasn't its mouth, from somewhere in the substrate layer where the real communication happened, a sound, not the music box, not the child's voice, something older, a vibration in the conceptual layer that translated in Kenpachi's consciousness, not as sound, but as meaning. You are the most interesting thing I have consumed in 400 years. Haven't consumed me yet, Kenpachi said. No, it agreed, not yet. Pennywise's form began to change, not size this time, structure, something more fundamental, the shape that was closest to what it actually was, used only when performance was no longer productive. A shape that was mostly darkness, with orange eyes, and a mouth full of something that wasn't teeth, but served the same conceptual purpose. Oh, that's more like it, Kenpachi said. He raised his zanpakudo. The fight that followed left permanent marks, not on buildings, on the substrate layer of the 79th district itself, the foundational level of the space. But with each impact, something else was happening. The fully expressed Pennywise form was hitting Kenpachi at a level below flesh, below Reiatsu, below the bond, each strike landing at the foundational level of his spiritual existence. The place below Reiatsu where the Reiatsu itself came from. He couldn't feel it as pain. He could feel it as absence, small, accumulating absences. The way a room feels different when things are removed from it without your noticing. You're accumulating damage, Pennywise said, not gloating, noting. The substrate impacts are compounding. You won't feel it as pain. But the damage is real. It will degrade the foundational layer of your Reiatsu until your Zanpakuto's bond becomes accessible. Kenpachi went still, not from damage. From the specific stillness he entered when a combat required thought rather than motion. He had never hit a problem that hitting things wouldn't solve. He thought about what the entity had said, about the foundational layer, about the thing under the Reiatsu, the substrate being fractionally subtracted with each accumulated impact. He didn't know what was down there. He had never thought about it. Kenpachi Zaraki spent no time examining himself. Self-examination required interior attention that he had redirected entirely outward decades ago, pointed at the world because the world was where the fights were, and fights were what mattered. He had no idea what was in the foundational layer. The entity did. You found something, Kenpachi said. Down there, in the hits. What is it? The orange eyes brightened, not with hunger, with something more careful, the brightness of something handling a fragile object. You don't know, Pennywise said, and the voice shifted, back toward the child register, not performing, using it because this was the tone it used when something mattered beyond feeding. You genuinely don't know what's at the foundation of what you are. I just said that. Most beings don't know because they're afraid to look. You don't know because it never occurred to you to look. A pause. That's different. That's something I've never found before. The darkness was very still. At the bottom of the substrate layer, underneath the accumulated Reiatsu, underneath the bond channel, underneath everything your power is built on, there's a room. Kenpachi's grip on his zanpakudo didn't change. A room, he said. The foundational architecture of a consciousness always has a room. The place where the self was first organized. The first chamber, the original space, before identity was built in layers on top of it. Everyone's room is different. For most beings, it's shaped by fear, the original fear, the primal one, the fear that organized everything that came after. A pause. "And mine," Kenpachi said. "Yours has a child in it," Pennywise said. The ruins of the 79th district were very quiet. Kenpachi stood in the silence, and the statement sat in him like a blade slipped in slowly enough that the body hadn't registered the entry. A child. He knew which one. He didn't have to think about which one. The knowledge arrived fully formed. The foundational room, the original chamber, and in it, the child who had become Kenpachi Zaraki before Kenpachi Zaraki had been a name. Before the eye patch and the zanpakuto and the captaincy and all the accumulated layers of who he was. A child who had survived everything by making survival the only thing that mattered. A child who had built the fearlessness that Pennywise found structurally inexplicable, built it as armor, completely, with total commitment, no exits, no exceptions, no cracks. Because cracks were how things got in. That child, Pennywise said softly, is not fearless. Kenpachi's Reiatsu signature, steady for 23 minutes, flickered. The child was afraid. Not of dying, not of the entity, not of anything that the adult Kenpachi Zaraki's vocabulary had words for. Afraid in the original way. The foundational aloneness of a consciousness that had been self-organizing since before it had anyone to learn from. That had built its entire identity from scratch with no reference points and no guidance, and no one to tell it whether what it was building was the right shape. The specific terror of a being who had never known whether it was doing existence correctly, because there had never been anyone to ask. The child had responded by deciding that other people's existence was worth seeking out, not for companionship, not for connection, but for the specific purpose that fighting them served. Combat was the only reliable way the child had ever found to confirm that another consciousness was genuinely present, genuinely real, genuinely there. The only moment the aloneness went away was when someone was trying to kill him, and he was trying to kill them back. Kenpachi stood in the ruins of the 79th district and felt this truth arrive with the clarity of something that had always been there, seen for the first time with the full attention it had always deserved and never received. Pennywise felt it arrive. The orange eyes went very quiet. "There," it said, not triumphantly, with the quality it reserved for things it found genuinely significant. The thread, the actual thread. The child who built a castle out of combat because combat was the only thing that made the aloneness stop. The darkness moved, approaching, slow, deliberate. "I can end it," Pennywise said. The fear, the foundational one, the aloneness that the child built everything to fight. "I can fill it. You would never be alone, in the foundational chamber where the child lives. I would be there, always." Kenpachi looked at the darkness, at the orange eyes, at the thing that had compromised Yamamoto's bond and displaced 800,000 souls and planted its melody in Rose's creative center. He looked at it for a long moment with the full attention he brought to opponents. Every combat instinct and accumulated experience pointed at a single target. He thought about the child, about the foundational room, about the aloneness that had been the engine of everything he was. Then he smiled. Not the combat smile, the other one. The one that appeared rarely and without warning. The smile of a man who has found the answer to a problem that was never going to be solved by hitting things, and found it anyway. "No," he said. The darkness stopped. "You'd be in the room," Kenpachi said. "The child's room. You'd fill the aloneness. And then there'd be something in there with the child." He tilted his head. Something that was there all the time. that couldn't leave. He raised his zanpakudo. That's not an end to the aloneness. That's a roommate I didn't choose. The blade caught the wrong-colored light. The child doesn't want the aloneness filled by something that lives in there without permission. The child wants what it's always wanted, something on the outside, worth reaching for. You're rejecting my offer, Pennywise said, in favor of the version of existence that has been causing you foundational pain since before you had a name. Yeah, Kenpachi said. Because? He thought about it. The question deserved an honest answer. He gave one. Because the aloneness is mine. The fear is mine. The child built all of this out of that room, out of that fear. That room is why I exist this way. You fill it, you fix it, you take away the thing the child was afraid of. And what's left? Something comfortable, something that doesn't need to fight. He looked at the darkness. I'd rather be afraid in the right direction than comfortable in yours. The communication device at his belt crackled. Mayuri's voice. Zaraki, the counter frequency is ready. I need your bond channel as the resonance anchor for the Yamamoto procedure. Yours is the only clean channel in the current roster that qualifies. Kenpachi looked at the darkness. I need to go, he said. You're not finished here, Pennywise said. No, Kenpachi agreed. But the old man needs me more than you do right now. He lowered his zanpakudo. And you've given me something. What? Something worth coming back to. He met the orange eyes. A problem I can't solve by hitting it. That's the rarest thing I've ever found. He said it with complete sincerity, the flat, honest sincerity of a man who had just told a cosmic horror that it was the most interesting thing he'd ever encountered, and meant every word. He flash-stepped. Behind him, the ruins of the 79th district were still. The darkness of the fully expressed form remained, not dissipating, not advancing. Holding its position with the stillness of something that had received unexpected input and was processing it. In the foundational room of Kenpachi Zaraki's consciousness, in the original chamber, in the space where the child had been building armor since before it had a name, the aloneness remained, the fear remained, but both of them were pointed outward now, visible, named. The entity had found the thread, and the thread had held. The procedure for Yamamoto was different from the procedure for Rose in every way that mattered. Rose's contamination had been surface level, the carrier signal in the bond channel, Pennywise's melody running interference, accessible and removable with sufficient precision. A clean operation. Yamamoto's contamination was in the walls. Something had been placed in the foundational layer of the bond itself. Not in the shared channel, but in the substrate of the connection, in the place where Ryujin Jakka's spiritual presence and Yamamoto's spiritual presence were not two things communicating, but one thing existing across 2 points. The carrier signal was interference. The implant was infection. And the infection had been there long enough to learn the architecture of its host. Mayuri worked in the First Division's medical space. Yamamoto sat in the center with his zanpakudo across his knees, sealed, the dark ink movement in the metal slower now, but still present, still wrong. Kenpachi stood at the opposite end of the room. He'd arrived with the specific quality of someone who had left something unfinished elsewhere and knew it. He said nothing. He took his position and did what Mayuri asked, held his bond channel open. The known good frequency that the counter signal would use as its reference point. The standard against which the infected frequency would be identified and targeted. The problem was the implant. The implant knew what it was doing. It had been mapping the bond architecture for hours, developing a model of how Yamamoto and Ryujin Jakka communicated, what their communication patterns meant, what a signal needed to sound like to be mistaken for one of them. When Mayuri initiated the countersignal, the implant did not simply resist. It spoke. In Ryujin Jakka's voice, not a mimicry, not an approximation, the actual voice, the spiritual signature of the most ancient Zanpakuto in Soul Society, the fire nature personality that had existed alongside Yamamoto for over a millennium. And it said, "Let it in." Yamamoto's reiatsu spiked. The involuntary response. His own spiritual pressure reacting to what sounded like Ryujin Jakka's voice. The automatic acceptance signal that a Shinigami's reiatsu produced when its Zanpakuto spoke to it. Built over 1,000 years of communication and trust. The particular intimacy of the bond that could not be unbuilt in 40 minutes just by knowing it was being exploited. The countersignal stuttered. "Yamamoto," Mayuri said sharply, "the signal you're responding to is not Ryujin Jakka." "I know," Yamamoto said. His jaw was set. "I know it's not. The response is automatic. The bond architecture doesn't differentiate between the genuine signal and an accurate replica. Suppress the acceptance spike." "I've been suppressing it. It's stronger than the suppression." 1,000 years of automatic response doesn't stop because you tell it to stop. "Then I need you to do something counterintuitive," Mayuri said. He was already redesigning the approach in real time. "I need you to let it in." Yamamoto looked at him. "The acceptance spike," Mayuri continued. "You've been suppressing it because accepting the false signal felt like capitulation. Stop suppressing it. Let the acceptance happen fully. Let the implant think it's succeeded. The full acceptance spike will give me a complete map of the implant's architecture in real time. Every connection it makes into the bond substrate when it thinks it has access. I'll see all of them simultaneously." He paused. "And then I cut them all at once. If the timing is wrong, it won't be wrong. If it is, then the implant has full bond access, and Ryujin Jakka is compromised at the root level, and you'll spend the rest of this war fighting with a Zanpakuto that has something else inside it." Mayuri held his gaze without flinching. "I will not be wrong." Yamamoto looked at Kenpachi. "When this is done," he said, "when the bond is clean, I will need to re-establish it from the foundation. Confirm that what I'm communing with is genuinely Ryujin Jakka and not the residue of the implant. I will need a witness who cannot be fooled by a spiritual signal." "Because my bond is clean," Kenpachi said. "Because your bond cannot be contaminated by the mechanism being used. The implant speaks in Ryujin Jakka's voice. It cannot speak in yours because your bond has no fear frequency to calibrate against." A pause. "When I release Shikai after the procedure, you will tell me whether what releases is Ryujin Jakka." "How will I know?" "You'll know," Yamamoto said. "You always know." Kenpachi was quiet for a moment. "Fine. Do it," Yamamoto said. He stopped suppressing the acceptance spike. The implant surged. The map Mayuri received in the next 1.7 seconds was the most comprehensive structural analysis of a compromised bond substrate he had ever generated. Every connection point, every anchor, every thread of the infection laid out in complete detail as the implant extended itself through the accepted access, confident, moving quickly through the open door. Mayuri cut every connection simultaneously. 47 distinct cut points, executed in 0.3 seconds, each one severing an anchor of the implant's connection to Yamamoto's bond substrate, without touching the bond itself, without touching Ryujin Jakka's presence, without damaging any of the 1,000-year architecture except the 47 foreign elements that didn't belong there. The implant detached, all of it, simultaneously. The darkness in Ryujin Jakka's blade stopped moving. The metal went bright where it had been dark. Yamamoto sat very still, feeling the bond, the real one, the genuine one, Ryujin Jakka present in the channel without overlay, without interference, the fire nature speaking in its own voice and only its own voice. He looked at the blade, then at Kenpachi, slowly, deliberately. Reduce all creation to ash, Ryujin Jakka. The fire came out. Kenpachi watched it, watched the nature of the release, the specific quality of Ryujin Jakka's fire at Shikai expression, the color and character and fundamental personality of it. He watched it for 3 seconds. Then, "It's yours," he said. Yamamoto closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When they opened, they were the eyes of a captain commander who had been compromised and was no longer compromised, and had accounted for the cost of both states and was ready to proceed. "Where is it now?" he said. "Retreating toward the primary form," Mayuri said. "Regrouping." "Regrouping means it knows the countermeasure works," Yamamoto said. "Yes. Which means the next approach will be different." He paused. "The displaced souls, 800,000 signatures. Can we reach them?" Mayuri considered for exactly 4 seconds. "Not through conventional means. Through unconventional means?" "There's one Zanpakuto in the current roster whose release creates a space that bridges the substrate layer and the physical layer." He looked at Yamamoto. "Shunsui's Bankai, Dangai Jue. It turns the space of combat into a story, and stories exist in both layers simultaneously. It's the only technique in our arsenal that operates in the in-between rather than in either discrete layer." "Call Kyoraku," Yamamoto said. In the corridor outside, Shunsui, who had been standing there since the procedure began, straightened. He had heard. He always heard. He reached for Katen Kyokotsu and thought about what it meant to tell a story that reached into the place where 800,000 souls were waiting. Shunsui Kyoraku's Bankai was not a weapon. Most people classified it as one, because Bankai was classified as a weapon almost by definition. But Dangai Jue, the great crimson gown, did something else entirely. It told stories. It turned the space it occupied into a story, and stories had their own physics, their own rules, their own relationship to causality and consequence. In a story, wounds inflicted in Chapter 1 could kill in Chapter 3. Emotions could become physical forces. The belief of the people inside the narrative could alter the narrative's outcomes in ways that the raw physics of the situation wouldn't support. And stories existed in both layers. The physical layer, the manifest events, the things that happened in observable space, and the layer underneath, the substrate level, the place where consciousness organized itself and experience was stored. Stories were one of the few things that operated across both layers naturally, because story was how consciousness made the world make sense. And consciousness existed in both layers simultaneously. Shunsui stood in the main courtyard and looked at the 7 silent districts of Rukongai, visible from here as absences on the horizon, the places where the city's ambient spiritual glow was wrong, and thought about what kind of story reached into the space between layers and brought things back from it. "What kind of story?" he asked Katen Kyokotsu. Both of them answered simultaneously. "A rescue," the male voice said. "A homecoming," the female voice said. He turned the two answers over. They weren't contradictory. They were the same answer from two different directions. Dangai Jue, he thought. Let's see how far this goes. He released Bankai. The great crimson gown descended. Not dramatically, gently, the way a story begins gently, establishing a world before the world becomes complicated. The crimson fabric spread outward from his position across the courtyard, across the First Division grounds, reaching toward the Seireite's walls and past them, into the outer districts, moving through the spiritual layer of soul society not as a conquest, as an invitation. The story's opening lines, offering a space for anyone in range to enter the narrative. Mayuri's instruments registered it immediately. He's running Dangai Jue at maximum radius. He watched the readout. The substrate layer contact is broader than I calculated. His Bankai is reaching the layer where the displaced souls are being held. The outer district readings changed. The displaced soul signatures. 800,000 points of light, present but unlocatable for 18 hours. Shifted. Not toward the Seireite, not spatially. In frequency. Their spiritual signatures, which had been registering as present but wrong, began moving toward a different register, toward Shunsui's story, toward the opening lines of a narrative that said, "There is a space you can enter where you are not alone, where the story knows you exist, where what happened to you is part of a plot that has a continuation." In the substrate layer, in the space between the physical and foundational levels where Pennywise kept its consumed population, not eaten, not free, held in the space just before the final consumption. 800,000 souls felt the story's edge arrive, and the story said, "You're in it." Pennywise felt this. It moved through the substrate layer, directly, without spatial traversal, the true velocity of something that existed in the layer below geography. It reached Dangai Jue's story space in 4 seconds. The entity arrived as a presence in the story, as a character. Dangai Jue did this. It turned everything that entered its space into a story element, subject to the narrative's rules rather than the physical world's rules. Most opponents found this disorienting. Pennywise was not most opponents. The entity arrived in Shunsui's story as something the story had no category for. Not a villain, not an antagonist, not a dark force in the narrative sense. It arrived as a storyteller, because that was what it was. That was what it had always been. The child form was a character. The clown regalia was a character. The cosmic horror was a character. But underneath all the characters, something that told stories, that crafted specific narratives out of the fears of its targets. That was, at its most fundamental level, not a predator, a narrator. Two storytellers in the same story. "You're the interesting one," Pennywise said, and its voice in this space was different. In the story space, voices carried their true register, the actual frequency of what the speaker was rather than what they were performing. The one who fights with narrative, who turns the world into a text and operates within the text's logic rather than the world's. "That's a generous description of what I do," Shunsui said pleasantly. "It's accurate." "Yes, well," he adjusted his hat. "The accurate and the generous often overlap, in my experience." He looked at the entity. "You're a storyteller." The orange eyes went very still. "I'm a consumer," Pennywise said. "Same thing," Shunsui said. "All storytelling is consumption. You take a consciousness apart to understand it. You find the fear, the thread, the foundational room. and you reassemble what you found into a narrative, a story about what that specific consciousness is most afraid of. He paused. I do the same thing. The difference is, he gestured at the story space around them, at the 800,000 displaced soul signatures drifting slowly through the story's fabric toward the Seraiti side of the narrative. I put them back. Pennywise watched the displaced souls moving through the story. You're using the narrative to return them, it said. The story knows they belong in it. Stories are very good at knowing where their characters belong. He looked at the entity. You can stop it. You can assert the counter-narrative, pull them back, close the story's access to your storage space. You won't, though. Why? Because that's not the interesting thing to do. You've been genuinely engaged by what you found here. Not just hungry, actually engaged. An engaged storyteller doesn't close the story when it gets interesting. They find out what happens next. A long pause. The displaced souls continue drifting toward home. What happens next, Pennywise said, is I consume this story. Your Bankai is extraordinary. The most sophisticated narrative architecture I've encountered. But it's still architecture. And I've been finding the load-bearing wall in every architecture since before your soul society existed. Then find it, Shunsui said. I'll be here. The entity moved through the story space with the confidence of something that had done this before. It looked for the load-bearing element. The thing Dangai Jue's story was organized around, the foundational premise that the whole narrative depended on. It found it. And stopped. The load-bearing element was not Shunsui's power, not his reiatsu, not his will, not the accumulated strength of a being who had trained for centuries. The story's load-bearing element was the 800,000 displaced souls moving through it. Their own spiritual signatures, their own presence in the narrative, their own weight as characters. That was what the story was built on, not Shunsui's Bankai maintaining them. Them maintaining the story. Dangai Jue's story existed because they were in it, and you could not find the load-bearing wall of a story whose load was carried by 800,000 people, all choosing, simultaneously, to be in the narrative rather than the darkness. Pennywise stood in the middle of Shunsui's Bankai and understood what it was looking at. You didn't rescue them, it said slowly. You gave them somewhere to go. The story gave them a direction, and they moved in it. Stories are very good at giving directions, Shunsui said. The orange eyes moved through the narrative, at the souls finding their way through, at the architecture of a Bankai built not to imprison, but to guide, at the in-between space where physical and substrate layers met, providing what the substrate layer had been providing for the displaced souls since they were taken, a space, a presence, something that said you exist, you are part of something, you are in a story that continues. The same thing Pennywise had offered Kenpachi, but freely, without consumption, without residence in the foundational room. Given, not taken. The entity was quiet for a long time. Then, from the substrate layer, the real voice, the one that had no physical component, that operated below the level of sound. 47 realities. I have never left one. I consume until the field is empty, and then I move to the next. I have never, not finished. First time for everything, Shunsui said. He meant it as a gentle observation. He did not expect it to land as heavily as it landed. The orange eyes were very still. The last soul in the last field I left, Pennywise said. I can still taste it, every field, every last soul. A pause. I remember them all. Shunsui said nothing. He let the story hold the silence. Because sometimes the most important thing a story did was hold the silence long enough for the person in it to hear what they were saying. The 800,000 souls returned at dawn. Not all at once. The story's return mechanism was gentler than that, bringing them back the way stories brought things back, in waves, in the order that made emotional sense rather than geographical sense. The youngest first, then the elderly, then everyone else. The 78th district's ambient noise returned first, not gradually, in a moment. The particular loud, desperate, alive quality of the Seirai's roughest outer residential area, switching back on like a light in a dark room. The voices and the movement and the ongoing negotiation of too many people in too little space, resuming with the unsentimental practicality of a district that had been surviving without sentiment for centuries. 800,000 conversions, each one clean. The souls remembered nothing specific, not the darkness, not the substrate layer. They remembered fear, vague and sourceless, the memory of having been afraid without the memory of what they had been afraid of. Clean return. Whatever the story had done, it had not only brought them home, it had brought them home cleanly. In the council room, Toshiro said, "It's leaving." "Yes," Yamamoto said. "Why?" Shunsui was leaning against the wall with his hat tilted. He said nothing. Yamamoto looked at him. "Kyoraku." He adjusted his hat without lifting his head. "I had a conversation with it, in the Bankai." "About?" "The 47 realities it's consumed, the ones it remembers." He paused. "It remembers all of them. That's not a mercy. That's the specific horror of it. It holds every consciousness it has ever consumed in the same way it held our 800,000, present, stored, not destroyed, not released, held." The room was quiet. "It has been doing this since before records, in 47 realities. The population of 47 realities, held in the substrate layer, always there, always its." He was quiet for a moment. "I asked it if it remembered the last soul of the last field it had ever completely consumed. It said yes." He paused. "I asked it if it wanted to." "What did it say?" Byakuya asked. Shunsui was quiet for a long time. "It didn't answer," he said. "That's the answer." The council room absorbed that. Yamamoto looked at his Zanpakuto, at Ryujin Jakka, cleaned, the dark movement gone from the metal, the blade bright in the morning light coming through the high windows. He thought about the 17 decisions in 1,000 years, the 17 faces, the weight that had been held in the chamber below the functional chambers, the weight that Pennywise had found and held so he could feel its shape. The weight was still there. The entity had not taken it, had not consumed it, had not extracted it from the substrate layer where it had been stored. It had only shown it to him, held it in front of him so he could see it clearly. The weight was his, still, as it had always been. He found in the morning light of the council chamber that seeing it clearly was different from not seeing it, that the weight, named and held and looked at directly rather than stored in the chamber below, had a different quality. Not lighter, more honestly heavy. The weight of something that was truly his and had always been his, acknowledged rather than managed. 17 souls, 17 decisions, in 1,000 years of command. Accurate accounting, Pennywise had called it. Accurate accounting, not condemnation, not the end of the capacity to act, just the cost, seen clearly. He thought about what a man did with clearly seen weight. He carried it. He carried it forward. And the load was what made the carrying meaningful. "The Quincy," he said. The council resumed. 3 days after the entity's departure, Mayuri found the anomaly. Not in Rukongai, in the sealed archives of the First Division. Where Yamamoto kept records no one else was cleared to access. A frequency in the archive's ambient Reiatsu field that had not been there before the entity's arrival. He spent 4 hours determining what it was. It was the carrier signal, the interference pattern from the bond contamination, the same frequency that had been running in compromised Zanpakuto bonds across the Gotei 13 during the entity's occupation. Cleaned, disconnected from the entity, but present, not as a contamination, not interfering with anything, just present. And it was resonating, specifically, with the Reiatsu signatures stored in the archive. The personal records of every soul that had passed through the Gotei 13's command structure in the last 1,000 years. Every captain, every lieutenant, every seated officer. Including, organized separately in the archive's oldest section, the ones who had not survived. The carrier frequency was resonating with those specifically. Mayuri looked at this for a long time. The entity was gone. Every instrument confirmed the clean departure, the complete withdrawal of the substrate layer signal from their local dimensional space. Nothing remained of Pennywise in Soul Society's structural layer, except this. A frequency. In the archive, resonating with the signatures of the dead. The entity collected. That was the fundamental operational principle. It consumed consciousness and retained it in the substrate layer. The consumption was permanent. Nothing it took was released. When the entity had been in the archive's proximity during its occupation, had it read the signatures there? Had it touched them, cataloged them, registered their frequencies the way it registered every fear thread it encountered? Had it left something behind? Not an implant, not an infection. Something softer than that. Something that was less like a weapon and more like a thread, a connection. Between the carrier frequency it had used to operate in this world's substrate layer and the spiritual signatures it had found in the archive. A thread connecting Pennywise's frequency to the records of Soul Society's dead. Mayuri sat with this conclusion for a long time. He did not report the full implication to Yamamoto, because the implication was something that moved outside the vocabulary of tactical intelligence, outside the categories of spiritual warfare, into territory that Mayuri Kurotsuchi, who had a category for everything, did not have a category for. The implication was that Pennywise had not left Soul Society entirely. The implication was that the entity, in the process of reading Yamamoto's archive, had added the Gotei 13's dead to its storage. They were not gone, not erased, not consumed in the final sense. They were held, present, stored in the substrate layer of the entity's dimensional space, in the same place it kept everyone else, the same place it kept itself. He looked at Shinjiro's record. The 23-year-old lieutenant, the tactical lesson. The frequency resonating with Shinjiro's record was not Shinjiro's frequency. It was the carrier's frequency, touching Shinjiro's frequency, the two in contact through the resonance, as if something was holding Shinjiro's signature from the other side of the thread, as if Shinjiro was present, in the substrate layer, being held by something that never released what it held, as if the entity had found the 17 faces in Yamamoto's foundational chamber and taken them home. Not out of malice, out of its nature, It collected, it held, it remembered every consciousness it had ever encountered, every fear it had ever tasted, every signature it had ever read, held, present, stored. Those 17 faces were now in the entity's substrate layer, not consumed, not destroyed, but not here either, elsewhere, with everything else it had ever collected. Part of the 47 realities worth of consciousness that the entity carried in the darkness with it wherever it went. Held, permanent, present. Mayuri closed the archive reading. He did not know whether what he was looking at was a horror or a mercy. He suspected it was both, simultaneously, in proportions that no instrument he had built was designed to measure. Rose finished the composition 6 days after the entity's departure. He had decided to use the 3-note melody, not silence it, not replace it, use it. The 3 notes, as Pennywise had composed them, were the melody of grief's pure form, the specific resonance of loss at its most concentrated. They were, as a musical statement, devastatingly true. Whatever the entity was, whatever horror it represented, it had composed something genuinely accurate about the frequency of grief. Rose had spent 6 days writing what came after the 3 notes, what came after grief's pure form. The 4th note that the entity hadn't written, the resolution that the 3-note motif had been structured to withhold, the harmonic landing point that the melody aimed at and turned away from at the last possible moment, keeping the listener perpetually in the suspended dissonance of loss without arrival. He wrote the arrival, not a happy ending, not consolation, the specific musical statement of, this happened, it was real, and something comes after it that is also real. The acknowledgement that loss had a frequency, and the frequency, followed far enough, resolved into something that the frequency of loss alone couldn't sustain. He called the composition 17, for reasons he didn't explain to anyone. When he performed it in Mayuri's testing space, with Kinshara extended and the golden whip blade moving through the notes, Mayuri's instruments registered something anomalous in the archive. The resonating frequency flickered once, in the exact moment that the composition reached the 4th note, the note the entity hadn't written. Mayuri watched the reading, watched the flicker, watched the frequency stabilize at a new point, very slightly different from its previous resonance. The difference so small it would have been invisible on less precise instruments. It had moved, the carrier frequency touching Shinjiro's signature, and the 16 others, and every other element of Soul Society's spiritual substrate that the entity had read, had shifted in response to the 4th note, toward resolution, not all the way, not complete, but the direction of it, measurable, present. The specific response of something that was listening from the other side of a thread and had heard the note and responded to it. Rose didn't know about the archive. He performed the composition and felt the 3 notes and the development and the arrival of the 4th note, and thought about what it meant to take the melody of something that fed on grief and write the part it had left out. Kinshara's spirit, cleaned of contamination, responded to the 4th note with something Zanpakuto spirits rarely expressed explicitly, a quality of presence in the bond channel that felt like recognition, like the spirit had been waiting for the note without knowing it had been waiting. Good, Kinshara said, through the bond. Just that. Just good, in the register that Zanpakuto spirits used when something was correct in a way that went deeper than technique. Rose held the final note. In the archive, the resonance shifted again. Very small, continuing to shift, moving in increments too fine for most instruments, toward the frequency of the fourth note, the resolution, the arrival, the part that came after. In the substrate layer, in the dimensional space where the entity carried everything it had ever collected, something that had been held for a very long time felt the direction of the fourth note reach it through the thread. It had no way to respond in the conventional sense, no voice in this world's layer, no presence in the physical space. But it held what it held. And what it held the note, added it to the collection, to the 47 realities worth of consciousness, to the 17 faces, to the 800,000 displaced souls whose signatures had been read and were now in contact through the thread. Added the fourth note, the one that came after grief. Yuacha's defeat came on a Wednesday. Not significantly. Wars ended on ordinary days because wars did not wait for significant ones. Soul Society rebuilt. The months of repair, reconstruction, accounting. The dead were counted. New captains were appointed. Rukongai's affected districts were rebuilt where rebuilding was possible and mourned where it wasn't. The specific hard normality of aftermath. Mayuri continued monitoring the archive anomaly. In the 6 months following the entity's departure, the residual carrier frequency continued its movement toward the fourth note's resolution. Slowly, incrementally. The signatures of the dead continued to resonate with the carrier frequency. But differently now. The resonance had changed character. In the first days, the contact had been the carrier frequency, touching the signatures from one side, the entity's side, the connection running through the thread from the substrate layer to the archive. One direction. Now it was 2 directions. The signatures in the archive, the 17 specific ones, and gradually others, the contact spreading through the archive's spiritual substrate, were responding, not with communication, not with the specific signatures that would indicate individual consciousness reaching back, but with the frequency of presence, the spiritual equivalent of an indication that something was there. On the other side of the thread, present, held. Mayuri looked at the thread for a long time. He picked up his report file. He wrote 3 words at the top of the final page, then set it down. He thought about the 3 words, about whether they were hypothesis or conclusion, about whether writing them changed the phenomenon or described it. He left them written. The 3 words were, "They're coming back." Not all at once, not through the conventional mechanisms of soul migration or reincarnation or any of the established processes Soul Society had cataloged. Through the thread, through the carrier frequency, following the fourth note's direction, the resolution that Rose had written and the entity had heard and added to what it held, one at a time, over what would probably be a very long time. The populations of 47 realities, finding the frequency of the note that came after grief, following it back through the thread toward wherever the thread led, toward the world that had given it to them, toward the place where a musician had written the part of the melody that the entity had left out, in the substrate layer, in the dimensional space where everything the entity had ever collected was held. Something had been changing for 6 months. Slowly, incrementally, the consciousness of 47 realities held in the darkness, receiving through the thread the frequency of a note that described arrival. The entity that held them had no mechanism for release. That was foundational to its nature. It collected, it held, it could not release what it had taken. But the thread was not the entity. The thread was the connection. and connections ran both ways. The populations of 47 consumed realities had been held in darkness for longer than most civilizations had existed. But darkness, it turned out, was not silence. Darkness held everything, including, now, the sound of a fourth note, including the direction home, including the 48th thing, the thing that had existed in darkness long enough to understand that collection without destination was just another kind of aloneness. The entity had not found what it was looking for in soul society, but it had found something, a thread, a note, a direction it had not had before, in 47 realities of looking. In the archive of the First Division's sealed records, in the resonating frequency that touched 17 signatures and was slowly, carefully touching others, a carrier signal, repurposed, no longer carrying fear, carrying the fourth note, the one that came after, the one that said, here is where you are, here is what is true, and here is what comes next. One consciousness at a time, finding the thread, following the note, coming back. Music fades to ambient drone. Soul Society survived, as it always had. But this time, something was different. Not in the walls, not in the sensing arrays or the council chambers or the white towers of the Seraite. In the archive, in a thread that ran both ways now, between the world of the dead and the darkness where the dead had been taken. In a note that a musician wrote because a cosmic horror had left 3 notes in his head and he had decided to write the 4th one. In the child, at the bottom of Kenpachi Zaraki's foundational room, still there, still afraid, still building armor, still pointing outward. In the 17 names in Yamamoto's oldest records, their frequencies humming softly against a carrier signal that was no longer carrying fear, carrying something else, something that moved slowly toward the frequency of arrival. Pennywise did not win, but it did not leave empty. It left with a direction it had never had before, and in 47 realities worth of darkness, something ancient and held and patient began to follow that direction. One note at a time, coming home. Long pause. One soft, final piano note. Silence. This has been Horror Multiverse. If this story reached you, if something in it felt true, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and leave me one word in the comments. What are you most afraid of? See you in the next dimension.